There is a house on the north bank of the Thames at Twickenham in West London, where the river fog comes up off the water in late October and softens the edges of the white pinnacles until the whole building looks as if a child had drawn it in chalk on a damp slate. The lawns slope down towards the river. The pinnacles cluster above the roofline like teeth in a comb. The plaster is white. The windows are pointed. The walls are battlemented. There are quatrefoils cut into the parapets, and trefoils cut into the gables, and crockets running along every ridge like a row of crouched birds. This is Strawberry Hill House. What you are looking at is not a real medieval castle. It is a small Georgian villa dressed up in pasteboard and lath and painted plaster that one man spent 27 years and almost his entire inherited fortune turning into a Gothic dream. He bought the cottage on the site in 1747. He did not stop building until 1776. He died in the house in 1797, childless, aged 79, having spent his last decade as the 4th Earl of Orford. His name was Horace Walpole. He was the youngest son of Sir Robert Walpole, the first man in English history ever called Prime Minister, and he was, by general agreement of his contemporaries, an absurd person who had built an absurd house. For 200 years after his death, his house was a joke. Samuel Johnson dismissed it. The London wits called it the gingerbread Gothic. The architectural press called it a child's plaything. Joshua Reynolds visited and went away without a kind word in writing. In 1842, the entire contents of the house, the collection that Walpole had spent 50 years assembling, the cabinets and the cameos, and the suits of armour, and the Wolsey hat, and the cardinal's gloves, were carted out onto the lawn by an auctioneer called George Robbins and sold over 32 days to pay the gambling debts of a great-great-nephew who would himself be dead within 3 years of dissipation. Not a king, not a duke, not even an architect by training. Strawberry Hill is where a man who was mocked for 2 centuries wrote, by candlelight, on the night before Christmas 1764, the first Gothic novel in the English language, where a great-great-nephew gambled away the most important private collection assembled in 18th century England across 32 days of public auction, where the dead man's letters, 7,000 of them, would be picked up 140 years later by an American at Yale and turned into a 48-volume edition that is still, in 2026, the single most important primary source for the social history of Georgian Britain. This is the dark story of Britain's most mocked mansion, Strawberry Hill. If you find these deep investigations into Britain's great houses and the hidden lives within them worth your time, please subscribe to this channel, leave a comment telling me which estate we should explore next, and help these stories reach the audience they deserve. It begins with a small white cottage by the Thames. In 1747, Horace Walpole was 30 years old, a member of Parliament for the Rotten Borough of Collington in Cornwall, the youngest son of a Prime Minister who had been out of office for 5 years and dead since 1745. He had inherited from his father a London house, a sinecure as Usher of the Exchequer that paid him near £2,000 a year for the rest of his life, and what he himself called, in a letter to his cousin Henry Conway, a permanent embarrassment of being the last son of a great man. He was unmarried. He would never marry. He had been on the grand tour of Europe with the poet Thomas Gray between 1739 and 1741, and they had quarrelled on the road home and not spoken for years. He had no profession. He had no military career. He had been mocked at Eton for his thin frame and his high voice, and he was looking, in the spring of 1747, for a small house by the river where he could live quietly and arrange his books. He found it in Twickenham, a few miles upriver from Hampton Court, on the strip of land between the Thames and the Teddington Road. The cottage on the site was a small whitewashed building that had belonged, until shortly before Walpole's purchase, to a Mrs. Chenevix, who kept a famous toy shop in London and used the riverside cottage in summer. Walpole bought the lease for 40 guineas. He took possession in the June of 1747, and he wrote to his friend Horace Mann, the British envoy in Florence, on the 5th of January 1750, in a letter that survives among the 7,000 in the Yale edition of his correspondence, the sentence that would name and indict the project he was about to embark on. "It is a little plaything of a house," he wrote, "that I got out of Mrs. Chenevix's shop and is the prettiest bauble you ever saw. That sentence is the foundation document of Strawberry Hill, plaything. Bauble, a house got out of a toy shop. Walpole was telling his oldest friend that he was about to build something that would not be serious, that would not be grand in the manner his father's house at Houghton was grand, that would not pretend to be Palladio or Wren or Vanbrugh. It would be small, it would be private, it would be Gothic. In 1747, nobody in England built Gothic houses. The fashion was Palladian. The country was filling up with porticos and pediments and rusticated bases in pale Bath stone, designed by Burlington and Kent and their disciples, modelled on Roman temples by way of Vicenza. The Gothic of the old cathedrals at Canterbury and Wells and Salisbury was to a gentleman of the 1740s what the Dark Ages were. Pointed arches were for monks. Stained glass was for Catholics. Battlements were for Norman barons who had not yet learned manners. To propose a country villa built in the style of Westminster Abbey was to propose dressing for dinner in chain mail. But Walpole proposed it, and he proposed it in the form of a committee. He called it, in his letters, the Committee of Taste. It had 3 permanent members and a rotating cast of consultants. The first was John Shute, a quiet, learned Hampshire gentleman who had inherited the vine in 1754 and who had a draftsman's eye for medieval detail. The second was Richard Bentley, the son of the great classical scholar of the same name, a fluent draftsman with a flair for what Walpole called Gothic moderne, the painted plaster Gothic of imagination rather than archaeology. The third, for the early years, was Thomas Gray, the Eton school friend with whom Walpole had quarrelled in Italy and reconciled in 1745, and who would write at Walpole's request the Elegy written in a country churchyard while staying at Strawberry Hill in 1750. Later, after Bentley's quarrel with Walpole in 1761, the architect Robert Adam was called in to design the round drawing room. The committee met. The committee drew, the committee disagreed, and the house grew, room by room, decade by decade, between 1749 and 1776. It grew, deliberately, against precedent. Walpole did not commission a single architect to design a single coherent building in the manner of Lord Burlington at Chiswick. He took his cottage and added wings to it. He took the wings and added towers to them. He took the towers and added a long gallery with a fan-vaulted ceiling copied from the Henry VII chapel at Westminster Abbey, except not carved in stone like the original, but moulded in pasteboard and painted to look like stone. He added a tribune, an octagonal showroom modelled on the chapter house at York Minster, where he would display the most precious objects of his collection under coloured glass. He added a Holbein Chamber, hung with Holbein drawings borrowed in copy from the Royal Collection. He added a library with bookcases drawn by Shute from the choir of Old St. Paul's Cathedral as it had stood before the Great Fire. He added a round drawing room by Adam in 1771 with a chimney-piece copied from the tomb of Edward the Confessor at Westminster Abbey. Every room was a different Gothic theme. Every theme was a different cathedral, and every cathedral element was reproduced in plaster, painted plaster, gilded plaster, or pasteboard, because real medieval stone vaulting was beyond the budget of a sinecure holding younger son with 2,000 a year. Walpole knew this and was unembarrassed by it. The whole was, he wrote, a fragment of the world of dream, not a serious house, a bauble. By 1763, the principal rooms were finished. By 1776, the last tower was capped. The house was photographed in lithograph and described in pamphlet, and visited by personal application in writing by anyone respectable enough to be admitted, 4 at a time, between 12 and 3, no children and no dogs. Walpole printed his own tickets at the Strawberry Hill Press, which he had founded in 1757 in a small outbuilding by the gate, and which between 1757 and 1789 produced the first private fine press editions in England, including the first authorised collected edition of Gray's poems in 1768 and Walpole's own description of the villa at Strawberry Hill in 1774, illustrated with engravings of every room. But the Strawberry Hill Press also printed, in 1768, one of the strangest books in English literary history, and it was the book that Walpole had drafted 4 years earlier in a single night, at his Gothic writing desk in the upstairs library, The Castle of Otranto. The first Gothic novel. It is necessary to understand the rooms before the book. The Tribune held a chainmail glove said to have been Cardinal Wolsey's. The Holbein Chamber held a lock of hair said to have been Mary Tudor's. The Cabinet of Miniatures held a portrait said to have been of Anne Boleyn at 15. None of these provenances would survive scholarly scrutiny in the 20th century. All of them satisfied Walpole and his visitors in the 18th because the project of the house was not to be a museum in the modern academic sense, but to be a Gothic dream made physical, a stage set on which any object with a sufficiently Catholic and sufficiently medieval claim could be exhibited as if real. Walpole knew the difference between real and theatrical and did not, in this house, care to enforce it. He had been dreaming. By his own account, in a letter to William Cole of the 9th of March, 1765, of a giant hand in armour at the top of a staircase when he sat down in the early summer of 1764 and began to write a short novel. He wrote it, he claimed, in less than 2 months. He finished it on the 24th of December, 1764. He printed it anonymously at a London press on the 24th of December 1764, dated it Christmas Day on its title page, and claimed in the preface that it was a translation by one William Marshall, gentleman, of an Italian black letter manuscript printed at Naples in 1529, itself based on an earlier Catholic chronicle of the 11th century. It was none of those things. It was a Twickenham gentleman's invention, written at a Gothic desk, in a Gothic library, in a Gothic villa beside the Thames. It involved a tyrannical lord, a doomed bride, a giant helmet that crushed a young prince on his wedding day, a portrait that walked out of its frame, a ghost monk in the corridor, and a hereditary curse that resolved itself by the destruction of the castle and the restoration of the rightful line. It invented, between two pasteboard covers, almost every device that would furnish the next 2.5 centuries of Gothic and horror fiction. Mary Shelley would read it before writing Frankenstein. Bram Stoker would read it before writing Dracula. Anne Radcliffe owed Walpole The Haunted Castle. Matthew Lewis owed him The Corrupt Aristocrat. Edgar Allan Poe owed him The Falling House. Daphne du Maurier, working at Manderley by candlelight in the 1930s, owed him The Burning Mansion at the end. The whole of the modern Gothic, every haunted house, every secret passage, every cursed inheritance, every tyrant uncle, every doomed heroine running down a long corridor with a single candle, descends in a clean line from Otranto and from the rooms in which Otranto was written. And his contemporaries did not see it. They saw the gingerbread plaster and the pasteboard towers, and the little man with the high voice who took tea with his committee of taste. And they laughed. The mockery began before the house was even finished. As early as 1753, when only the south front had been transformed, the London wits had begun to call it the Gingerbread Castle. By 1760, the name was set. Walpole's correspondence is full of his own anticipatory parries against the laughter he calls his house, in letter after letter to Horace Mann and to George Montagu and to William Cole. The bauble, the plaything, the toy, the little Gothic castle, getting in front of the joke before others could deliver it. He understood. He knew that what he was doing was unfashionable in 1750 and unserious in 1770, and he chose to keep doing it for the simple reason that he found it amusing and that nobody could stop him. Samuel Johnson was the most consequential dismisser. Johnson visited Twickenham more than once, knew Walpole socially through their mutual acquaintances at the literary clubs, and considered him a frivolous man. Boswell records Johnson, in passing, as having said of Walpole that he was a man whose talent was for the small. Johnson did not write a formal essay against Strawberry Hill. He did not need to. His dismissal seeped into the literary water of the late 18th century by reputation alone. And by the time of his death in 1784, Walpole and his house had been consigned by the Johnsonian consensus to the category of the merely fashionable. Joshua Reynolds visited Strawberry Hill by Walpole's own ticketed arrangement in 1769. Walpole records the visit in a letter to Horace Mann. Reynolds said almost nothing during the tour, ate a polite dinner afterwards, and went back to London. He did not paint the house. He did not write a friendly note. He did not, in any surviving document, ever speak well of it. For Walpole, who craved Reynolds's good opinion above almost any other, The silence was an answer. The architectural establishment was harsher. The connoisseurs of the early 19th century, looking at Strawberry Hill with the new archaeological seriousness of Pugin and his generation, found it embarrassing. Augustus Welby Pugin, who in the 1830s and 1840s would create the new Gothic of the Palace of Westminster on archaeologically pure principles, regarded Walpole's pasteboard medievalism as a fraud and a sin against truth in materials. To Pugin, the painted plaster vault in the Long Gallery was not Gothic, it was costume. Walpole died on the 2nd of March 1797 in the upstairs bedroom at Strawberry Hill at the age of 79. He had become the 4th Earl of Orford in 1791 on the death of his nephew, an inheritance he had not sought and which he would not use, refusing to take his seat in the House of Lords. He left the house and its contents to his cousin, Anne Seymour Darmer, a sculptor of considerable original talent, the daughter of Field Marshal Conway, and a woman whose intimate friendships with other women were, by the standards of the discreet 18th century, openly remarked. She would live at Strawberry Hill until 1811, leave it to the next Walpole heir, and die in 1828. What followed between Damer's death and the auction of 1842 was a slow accumulation of disinterest. The Walpole collection sat. The plaster ceilings began to bow. The roof leaked. The heir was a great-grandnephew called George, who in 1842 was the 7th Earl Waldegrave, 26 years old, in serious gambling debt to a string of London bookmakers and West End clubs, and unwilling or unable to keep the collection together, he summoned an auctioneer. The auctioneer was George Robbins, the most theatrical man of his trade in early Victorian London, famous for an oratorical style of opening lots that approached preaching. Robbins surveyed Strawberry Hill, saw what was in front of him, and wrote in the introduction to the printed catalogue of the sale, dated the 25th of April, 1842, a single sentence that has been quoted in every account of the affair since. The most extraordinary single private collection ever offered for public sale in these realms. The auction opened on the 25th of April, 1842, and ran, with intervals for cataloguing and viewing, for 32 days until the 21st of May, 1842. 5,300 lots passed under the hammer on the lawn at Strawberry Hill in those 32 days. The catalogue, of which copies survive at the British Library and at the Lewis Walpole Library at Yale, runs to several hundred densely set pages. The lots ranged from full suits of armour to single cameos, from oil paintings to printed pamphlets, from Cardinal Wolsey's red hat to a lock of hair claimed to be Edward IV's. From the Holbein drawings to the manuscript of Walpole's own memoirs. The Cardinal's hat alone made £21. The Wolsey gloves made £9. A Reynolds portrait, of which Walpole had been particularly fond, made £240. The miniature of Anne Boleyn at 15, which Walpole had bought in 1758 from a Norwich bookseller for 3 guineas, and which he had treated for 40 years as one of the most personally beloved objects in the Tribune, made £46, and went to a Manchester collector whose name is recorded in the Lewis annotation as Mr. Ainsworth. The chainmail glove made £11. The carved oak chair, said to have belonged to Henry VIII, made £82, and went to the British Museum, where it sits today in the medieval gallery, the only major object from the 1842 sale to have re-entered a public collection within the 19th century. The Strawberry Hill press itself, the founts and the cases and the press bed on which Walpole had printed Otranto, and the collected grey and the description of the villa, was sold to a London printer as a job lot for £18 on the 7th day of the auction, and was, within a year, broken up for parts. The Tribune was emptied first, the Holbein Chamber after, the Long Gallery last. By the end of the 32 days, the house was bare. The walls retained the picture hooks. The cabinets retained the felt linings where the cameos had lain. The doors retained the locks Margaret Young had once carried the keys to, but the cabinets behind the locks were empty. Robbins's hammer had raised the sum of £35,000, more than 4 million in the money of 2026, every penny of which went, by deed of consignment, to George Waldegrave's creditors. The auction was reported in every London paper. The Times of the 3rd of May 1842 carried a leader on the affair that called the dispersal a national disgrace, and asked in a sentence that would be quoted in every subsequent account. What manner of country permitted the most important assembled private collection of medieval and Renaissance objects in its possession to be auctioned off in lots over 32 days to settle the gambling debts of a 26-year-old earl? The Athenaeum carried weekly reports. The Illustrated London News carried an engraving of the Long Gallery during a sale day, the bidders in top hats, the lots ranged on the green baize tables, the chandeliers still hanging from Walpole's pasteboard ceiling. Robbins himself, by all contemporary accounts, performed brilliantly. He held the room. He opened each lot with a small speech. He fetched, by the consensus of the trade press, prices considerably above the conservative estimates printed in the catalogue. Waldegrave himself died on the 28th of September, 1846, aged 29, of what his obituary in the Gentleman's Magazine called dissipation, and what the more candid private correspondence of his cousins called drink. He had been the 7th Earl for 10 years, and had managed, in that decade, to sell the most important assembled collection of medieval and Renaissance objects in private English hands. He had served, in 1840, 6 months in the Queen's Bench prison for assault upon a police constable in Pall Mall. He had been refused membership of 3 London clubs. He had spent, by the audit of his estate after his death, the sum of £74,000 in 9 years on horses, cards, and the pleasures of the West End. Of the £35,000 raised by Robbins, less than 400 remained in the Waldegrave bank account at the date of his funeral. His widow, Frances Braham, the daughter of an opera singer named John Braham, who had been the most celebrated tenor of the early 19th century, inherited the empty house. She was 25 years old, an actress's daughter, a Jewish-born convert to the Church of England, and a woman of formidable social ambition. She would marry, in sequence, 3 more men after Waldegrave's death, the last of them Chichester Fortescue, Liberal cabinet minister and Irish chief secretary. Through these 4 marriages, Frances rebuilt herself into Lady Waldegrave, Countess Waldegrave, hostess of the most consequential Liberal political salon in late Victorian England. And she did her hosting at Strawberry Hill. She did not restore the Walpole collection. She could not. It had been sold by lot to 200 buyers across 32 days and was, by the 1860s, scattered into private collections from Manchester to Boston. What she did instead was extend the house. Between 1856 and 1862, she added a Victorian Gothic wing to the east of Walpole's villa, designed by the architects Cubitt and Byrne, with a new dining room, a ballroom, and bedrooms for the political house parties at which he entertained Gladstone, Disraeli, Palmerston, Salisbury, Tennyson, and most of the front benches of both houses. Strawberry Hill in the 1860s and 1870s was the country house of the Liberal interest. It was not the Strawberry Hill that Walpole had built. It had grown, in stone and brick rather than pasteboard, into something more solid and considerably less interesting. Frances died on the 5th of July 1879, leaving the house to her 4th husband, Chichester Fortescue. He kept it for 10 years and then, in 1889, the political marriages over, sold it to a Catholic religious community. The buyers were the Vincentians, formerly the Congregation of the Mission, an order of Catholic priests founded by St. Vincent de Paul in 17th century France and dedicated to the training of clergy and the education of the poor. They paid £16,000. They moved into Strawberry Hill in 1923, after a period during which the house had been leased and partially shut up, and they established St. Mary's Roman Catholic Training College, a teachers' training institution for the Catholic schools of England and Wales, in Walpole's Gothic rooms. The Holbein Chamber became a chapel. The Tribune became a library. The Long Gallery became a refectory. The Round Drawing Room became a common room for the seminarians. For 87 years, from 1923 until 2010, Strawberry Hill was a Catholic institution. The young men trained for the priesthood in Walpole's house. The young men trained as teachers. The seminary expanded into modern brick buildings on the grounds. The original villa was used, maintained at minimal cost. painted over where the paint flaked, repaired where the roof failed, and slowly degraded as Walpole's painted plaster vaults absorbed the damp of the river. There was an irony in this that nobody at the seminary missed, and that scholars of Walpole have remarked on ever since. Walpole had written in the preface to the second edition of The Castle of Otranto in 1765 that the story was told as if by a Catholic priest of the 11th century. It is a fragment of the world of dream. For nearly a century after 1923, the rooms in which Otranto was conceived were, in fact, occupied by Catholic priests. The dream had become its institution. But the rehabilitation of Walpole as a serious literary figure had already begun, an ocean away in the 1920s. In 1922, an American collector named Wilmarth Sheldon Lewis, then a recent graduate of Yale, walked into a Boston bookshop and bought a single Walpole letter for $8. He had read Walpole at college. He was 27 years old. He had no plans to become the world's leading scholar of an 18th century English man of letters. He bought the letter on impulse, and by 1937, 15 years later, he had assembled at his house in Farmington, Connecticut, what was already the largest collection of Walpoleana in the world, including original letters, original manuscripts, original Strawberry Hill press books, and an original copy of the 1842 Robbins auction catalogue, annotated by hand with the names of the buyers of every one of the 5,300 lots. In 1937, the Yale University Press published the first volume of what would become the Yale edition of Horace Walpole's correspondence, edited by Lewis and a team of scholars. The first volume covered the letters to Horace Mann. The edition would run over the next 46 years to 48 volumes, each one hundreds of pages long, edited with a scholarly apparatus of footnotes, identifications, and contextual essays that was, by general consent, the most ambitious editorial undertaking ever applied to a single English letter writer. Lewis wrote, on opening the first volume in 1937, a sentence that survives in his introduction. I have read Walpole's letters for 40 years. I have only just begun to understand the man. He would read them for another 42 years, until his death in 1979. The final volume appeared in 1983. Lewis's house in Farmington, with its collection of nearly 40,000 Walpole-related items, became the Lewis Walpole Library and was bequeathed to Yale. The Yale edition did slowly what Walpole's contemporaries had refused to do. It restored him. It demonstrated, footnote by footnote, the range of his correspondence, the seriousness of his political analysis, the depth of his reading, the precision of his historical observation, and the human warmth of his attachments. The Walpole who emerges from 48 volumes is not the gingerbread frivolous of Samuel Johnson's Dismissal. He is a man of formidable intelligence who chose, deliberately, to write in private letters rather than in public essays, and who built a house in private taste rather than in public style, and who paid the social price of both choices for 200 years. By the 1960s, the academic consensus had turned. By the 1980s, every English literature syllabus in the world that included the 18th century included Walpole's letters as required reading. By the 1990s, the Vincentian Fathers at St. Mary's, by then St. Mary's University College, and engaged in the slow business of becoming a full university, had begun to ask what was to be done about the deteriorating fabric of the villa they had been using as a teacher training college for 70 years. The roof was failing. The painted plaster in the long gallery was lifting from its battens. The Tribune ceiling had been condemned, and the original Walpole rooms, which the seminary had used for decades without ceremony, were now recognized by English heritage and by every architectural historian in the country as the foundation document of the entire Gothic Revival. In 2002, a charity was formed. It was called the Strawberry Hill Trust. It took a long lease from the university and set about raising the money to restore Walpole's villa to its 1763 state, the year of the first published description, when the principal rooms had been finished and Walpole had begun the work of cataloguing his collection. The estimated cost of restoration was £9 million. The Heritage Lottery Fund provided 4. The World Monuments Fund provided some. Private donors, including the Lewis Walpole Library, provided the rest. The work began in 2007, but the house that astonishes the visitors who walk through it now was not built by the 4th Earl of Orford, whose name is carved on its commemorative plaque. Their presence at Strawberry Hill is documented, recorded in ink on paper. Their stories are not. The first was a woman named Margaret Young. She entered Walpole's service as housekeeper in 1750 when the Long Gallery was still a building site, and she wore the keys to the Walpole collection on a chatelaine at her waist for the next 47 years. We know she came from a Twickenham family. We know she was paid £16 a year in 1750, rising to 24 by 1790, the increase noted in Walpole's own household account books, copies of which survive in the Lewis Walpole Library archive. We know she was trusted with the keys to the Tribune, the showroom of the most valuable objects, and that on the days when admitted visitors were shown through the house in their parties of four, it was Margaret who unlocked the door and stood by the cabinet while they looked, and locked the cabinet again when they had gone. We know she was at Walpole's bedside on the 2nd of March 1797 when he died. We know she stayed on under Anne Darmer until her own death at Twickenham in 1810. We know nothing else, not where she was born, not whether she had been married, not whether she had children, not where she was buried, not what she thought in the long evenings after Walpole's death of the man whose collection she had guarded for 47 years. The second was a man called John Eckhart. He came into Walpole's service in 1772 as major domo, German-born, recommended by a London merchant who had employed his family. We know he was paid £40 a year, twice Margaret Young's wage, with a uniform allowance of £12. We know that between 1772 and 1797, he kept the catalogue of the Walpole collection, entering each new acquisition in a bound vellum book that survives in his own hand at the Lewis Walpole Library, where it is catalogue MS 49 in the Walpole Household Papers. We know he was the man Walpole entrusted with the keys to the Tribune in the housekeeper's absence. We know he was pensioned, by the terms of Walpole's will, of 1796 at £30 a year for life. We know nothing else. Not where he had been born in Germany, not when he had come to England, not what became of him after 1810, when the pension payments end in the Walpole estate ledgers without note of his death. The third was a woman named Sarah Lewis. She was laundress at Strawberry Hill between 1855 and 1879, paid 11 shillings a week, listed in Francis Waldegrave's household books under the kitchen wing wages. We know she was the woman who cleaned and packed contents of the Victorian wings during the great inventory taken on Francis Waldegrave's death in 1879. An inventory of which the surviving pages are in the Somerset Record Office. We know her name appears beside the description of every laundered linen in that inventory because she was the one who folded each piece for storage. We know she died at Twickenham in 1900, aged 76, and was buried in the parish churchyard at St. Mary's. We know nothing else. They appear in the records as footnotes, a name beside a sum, a quarterly wage entered into a bound ledger, and then they vanish into the silence that swallows everyone in a great house who is not a member of the family. Margaret Young guarded a collection that was sold from under her successors in 1842. John Eckhart catalogued objects that were dispersed in his lifetime to other rooms across England. Sarah Lewis folded linen that has not survived. We know only that they were there, that the house they served is still standing, and that their names survived. Some of them because the Walpole Estate Office and the Waldegrave household kept their accounts, and the Lewis Walpole Library at Yale and the Somerset Archive kept the books, and nobody threw the ledgers away. The house absorbed them all. The restoration was completed in 2010. The principal rooms, the Long Gallery, the Tribune, the Holbein Chamber, the Round Drawing Room, the library were returned to their 1763 state on the basis of Walpole's own description of the villa at Strawberry Hill, his Strawberry Hill press inventories, the engravings made by John Carter in the 1780s, and the colour samples taken from beneath layers of Victorian and Vincentian overpaint. The fan-vaulted ceiling of the Long Gallery, the one that contemporaries had called gingerbread, was conserved in pasteboard and replastered where collapse was imminent. The coloured glass of the Tribune was reset. The Holbein Chamber was rehung with full-size copies of the original drawings on loan from the Royal Collection. The Round Drawing Room was repapered in Walpole's own crimson. sourced from a fragment surviving behind a Victorian battening. The house reopened to the public for the first time in its history as a freely visitable museum on the 8th of October 2010. 80,000 people came in the first year. The Strawberry Hill Trust runs it now, with a small staff and a volunteer corps drawn largely from the Twickenham community. The annual operating cost is approximately £1 million. The visitor income covers most of it. The shortfall is met by the Heritage Lottery Fund, by the Friends of Strawberry Hill, and by an endowment partly funded from Yale. In 2018, the restoration was recognised by the European Heritage Award, the EU's most prestigious conservation prize, the citation singling out the meticulous archaeological recovery of Walpole's 1763 colour scheme, and the Trust's commitment to making the house accessible to a general public for whom Gothic Revival meant nothing more than a vague 19th-century church style. The next-door site, where the Vincentians had built their seminary blocks in the 20th century, is now St Mary's University, an independent Catholic university with around 6,000 students sharing the gates and the riverfront with the Trust, but separate in governance and use. The Trust has also begun, slowly, the work that no one in 1842 thought possible. Lot by lot, sale by sale, gift by gift, it has been reassembling fragments of the dispersed Walpole collection. By 2024, it had reacquired, by purchase or by long loan, more than 400 of the original 5,300 lots. Some came from the Lewis Walpole Library on indefinite loan from Yale. Some came at auction, bought by the Trust at Christie's and Sotheby's in London and New York. Some came as bequests from private collectors whose grandfathers had bought a single lot at Robbins's sale in 1842, and whose families had kept it on a hall table for 5 generations. The Holbein Chamber in 2024 contains real Holbein drawings on loan from the Royal Collection for the first time since 1842. The Tribune contains the Wolsey hat on permanent loan from a private trust. The Long Gallery contains, in the cabinet beside the south window, the carved oak chair, returned by the British Museum on a 5-year rotating loan that began in 2019. Each object has its own catalogue card. Each card records the buyer in 1842, the chain of subsequent owners, and the date of return. The walls are filling up again. The cabinets are filling up again. The house is, by the slow, patient work of a small charity with limited funds, being put back together. A faint ghost story attaches to the upstairs library, the room in which Walpole wrote Otranto in the summer of 1764. The Trust's volunteers, who do the night closing up rounds, report a recurring slight cold spot on the threshold of the room, and a single book on the shelf by the south window, an annotated facsimile of the 1764 Otranto, which several volunteers have independently reported finding on the desk in the morning, when it had been replaced on the shelf at closing the night before. The Trust does not advertise the story. It does not feature in the published material. It is the kind of thing the volunteers tell each other in the small staff kitchen behind the Holbein Chamber, in the way that small house museums everywhere tell themselves the small, uncanny stories that accumulate around houses whose dead occupants were closely identified with the rooms in which they wrote. The Castle of Otranto is still in print. Penguin Classics keeps an annotated edition, edited by E.J. Cleary, in continuous publication. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, every academic introduction to it, begins by establishing Walpole's novel as its ancestor. Bram Stoker's Dracula, every academic introduction to it, names Otranto in the second paragraph. Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, with its house Manderley burning at the close, is read in every literature seminar as the modern descendant of Walpole's burning castle of Otranto. The genre Walpole invented in a single night in December 1764 in the upstairs library at Strawberry Hill has become, by the count of any reasonable cultural historian in 2026, the dominant strand of English-language popular fiction over the last 2.5 centuries. The Walpole letters at Yale, the 48 volumes Lewis spent 60 years editing, are accessible online through the Yale Walpole Library's digital edition, which since 2017 has put the entire correspondence searchable on a public website. Scholars in every country in the English reading world use it daily. It is, by general agreement, the single largest scholarly edition of any English man of letters before Dickens, and the single most important primary source for the social, political, and cultural history of mid-18th century England. Stand at the south front of Strawberry Hill on an October afternoon. Stand at the south front of Strawberry Hill on an October afternoon, when the Twickenham mist has risen from the river and softens the edges of the white plaster pinnacles until they look not solid but drawn, and the visitors who have come down from London for the day are walking back across the lawn towards the gate, and the lights are coming on inside the long gallery so that the fan-vaulted ceiling glows faintly through the windows, and the river is silver behind you, and the trees are red and gold along the boundary wall, and the house in front of you looks from this angle exactly as it looked in the engraving on the title page of the 1774 description of the villa at Strawberry Hill. And you can see, if you know what to look for, the joins between Walpole's 18th century plaster and Francis Waldegrave's 19th century brick, and the Vincentian repairs of the 20th century and the Trust's restoration of the 21st. And you can see the pinnacles that the wits called gingerbread, and the battlements that Pugin called fraudulent, and the painted plaster that Joshua Reynolds went away from without writing a kind word. And you can see, if you know what Walpole knew, that all of it is a fragment of the world of dream. Strawberry Hill is not one house. It is the record in pasteboard and plaster and painted lath and Victorian brick of what happens when a man builds for his own pleasure in defiance of his century's taste, and is mocked for 200 years, and is, in the end, vindicated by the slow movement of the future towards him. Horace Walpole wanted a small house by the river where he could keep his books and his collection. The house gave him 47 years of it, and a long gallery, and a tribune, and a Holbein Chamber, and a round drawing room by Robert Adam. The Committee of Taste wanted a Gothic dream made physical. The house gave them their dream and the laughter of their contemporaries. Thomas Gray wanted somewhere quiet to write an elegy. The house gave him a guest room, and the elegy was written and published in 1751. George Waldegrave wanted money to settle his gambling debts. The house gave him £35,000 at auction in 1842, and 3 years later it gave him a grave at 29. Frances Waldegrave wanted to be a political hostess. The house gave her Gladstone and Disraeli and a liberal salon for 20 years. The Vincentian fathers wanted a place to train priests and teachers. The house gave them 87 years of seminary and the slow rotting of Walpole's plaster. Wilmarth Lewis wanted to understand a single 18th century letter writer. The house gave him, by way of 48 volumes at Yale, a life's work that has reset the academic estimate of Walpole forever. The house gave them all what they asked of it in the careful, expensive, neutral manner of a great country house accustomed to absorbing human weather. The house always gives. That is its genius, and that is its cost. Margaret Young guarded the keys for 47 years. John Eckhart catalogued the cabinets. Sarah Lewis folded the linen. They are in the ledgers and not in the histories, in the household account books and not on the bronze plaques, and the house has absorbed them as it has absorbed everything else. And the long gallery in which Margaret Young stood by the cabinet on visitor afternoons in 1772 is the same long gallery in which a Twickenham volunteer stood by the cabinet on visitor afternoons in 2025. And the keys are different, but the act of guarding is the same. And the curated memory of the house includes both of them, whether the visitors notice or not. Who does a building like Strawberry Hill belong to? The Earl, who built it from a cottage and a toy shop bauble, the Committee of Taste, who drew the rooms, the Strawberry Hill press that printed the books inside it, the novel that was written upstairs on the night before Christmas 1764, auctioneer who emptied it over 32 days in 1842, the actress's daughter who rebuilt it as a liberal salon, the Vincentian priests who said Mass in the Holbein Chamber for 87 years, the American at Yale who spent 60 years editing the letters, the Margaret Young and the John Eckhart and the Sarah Lewis who appear in the ledgers and not in the histories, the 80,000 visitors each year who walk the long gallery and look up at the fan-vaulted ceiling and see, for one moment, what Horace Walpole saw on the night the plasterer finished it in 1763. The house does not answer. The house never answers. It simply stands, with its white pinnacles and its painted vaults and its faintly paler block of plaster above the Tribune door where the 2010 restoration met the 1923 repair, and lets you decide. 200 years of mockery, 6,000 letters at Yale, 5,300 lots at Robbins's auction, 47 years of a housekeeper's chatelaine, one Gothic novel written in a single night in December 1764, one European Heritage Award in 2018, one fan-vaulted ceiling of pasteboard and lath, painted to look like the stone vaults of the Henry VII chapel, copied in every Gothic Revival University chapel built in England since. Walpole wrote at the upstairs desk by the south window. He wrote his letters there. He wrote Otranto there. He died, by the surviving record of his physician, in the bedroom across the corridor on a March morning in 1797, with Margaret Young at the door and John Eckhart at the bedside. He is still up there. He always will be. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see a building differently, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me which estate, dynasty, or hidden history we should investigate next. There are hundreds of these stories waiting to be told, and every one of them is hiding something beneath the surface.